Hi all, welcome back, and apologies for me that the last break was slightly shorter than 10 minutes, but after this we do have lunch, so you'll have some more time to rest. I'm going to really quickly hand over to the brilliant Terry, who's going to be taking us with an amazing panel on a journey around ecological imagination and how we think with non-human beings. So over to Kerry.
Thanks, Farah, and great to see everybody. And I look forward to seeing my colleagues joining me online in a second. Welcome to this session. I'm Kerry Facer. Welcome to those of you who've been with us all morning, and to those of you who are just joining us. So I'm a professor of education and social futures at the University of Gothenburg, and I'm one of the co-curators of this lovely event. And this panel is going to explore the question of the ecological imagination. We're going to specifically explore how our relationships with land, or in different places we might call it country or territory, and with the non-human beings that are part of that, are critical for shaping and opening up our imaginations. And we've got three fantastic partners in the conversation. We have Nick Hayes, who is an illustrator, the co-founder of the Right to Roam campaign, and the author of the best-selling book, The Book of Trespass, which was the book that I gave to pretty much all of my family last year. I've insisted many people read it. So if your figures for sales, Nick, are looking good, I'm definitely behind some of that. Really amazing work he's doing. We also have the fantastic Charlotte de Cann, who is a writer, editor and co-director of the Dark Mountain Project. And this is one of the most significant influences on, I think, our collective thinking about the role of the arts and imagination in facing social and ecological collapse. She's also a wonderful educator, maybe not a word she'd describe for herself, but her practices are really, really valuable in helping to reframe our imagination. And last, we have Anab Jain, who is a professor of design investigations at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna. She's a filmmaker, she's a designer, she's a futurist, she's co-founder of Superflux, and she's one of those people who, if I mention her name to any of my design or futurist friends, their eyes light up. This woman is doing really amazing work. So I'm really honoured and delighted to have all of you here. What we're going to do is start with a little invitation to Nick, Anab and Charlotte to think through their take on the ecological imagination. And then we're going to go into a bit more of a free-form conversation. So we're not quite sure what's going to happen. Let's see where we go. So let's start off with Anab. Anab, your latest project, Cascades, states, amongst other things, that the interrelations between internal and external, human and more than human, are empowering and encouraging forces that catalyze Cascade Inquiry's ecological movement building. I wonder if you could unpack both that and your sense of how do you understand this phrase, ecological imagination? What does it mean for you?
Sure. I suppose Cascade Inquiry is quite a new initiative. We're still trying to make sense of it, but it's really maybe, the way you phrase it, at the heart of it is the idea of nurturing collective ecological imagination. And I suppose in our practice, we are practitioners. I'm a practitioner in terms of, I think of the work we do as a kind of a craft, that we have an active relationship with the materiality of the future of our ecologies, and that in the working through these materialities, we are actively shaping each other. So for me, I suppose it is ideas of wholeness and interdependence and partnership and energy flows and flexibilities and cycles and diversity and all these kind of things that really are key ideas of ecology that are nurtured through ecological imagination. I kind of, my own roots and histories are steeped in myths and legends rather than science fiction. I didn't grow up with any science fiction as such. So that has allowed me to kind of think of a few years ago, I wrote this manifesto called Calling for a More Than Human Politics, which is inviting people to move from a more human-centered thinking to a more than human-centered thinking. And over the last few years, our practice, Superflux, has been trying to manifest these ideas and make them more tangible. So, and one of the projects, I suppose, is Refuge for Resurgence, that kind of foregrounds this idea of ecological imagination that we are trying to make manifest, so that it's active within us experientially through myths, and so it's a myth of 14 species sitting around a banquet in an imagined dinner that they're having together, including fox and a rat and a wasp and a pigeon and a cow and human adults and a child. And it is to resuscitate a reciprocal ecological relationship with the future, with the earth. And I think that for me, facts and data and science are just not nurturing the ecological imagination. We need, therefore, we're leaning heavily into these other narrative forms that allow for the ecological imagination to flourish. Myths have binding capacities of connecting us to futures and prehistories simultaneously. They have the capacity to reconcile us to different species, to different temporalities, and to different cosmologies. And that's something that I really think that we are moving past, these space-time barriers, if you like, when we're talking of ecological imagination. It's in a way the idea that every act is a cosmic event connected across space and time. So I stop here, but that's how I...
Well, that's got us started. So every act is a cosmic event connected across space and time. That's wonderful. Actually, as a result of that, I'm going to go to Charlotte next, because Charlotte, I know, talks about the time we're living in as a moment of turning to the underworld, for which we'll need allies in nature. And I know that you, so I wonder if you can pick up on this question. What does the ecological imagination mean to you?
Wow, it's such a big question, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Where do you start? I quite like to start with the stone, actually. I'm going to come to your very good question in a minute, Terry. But I think I'm using this stone because it starts with this. It starts with the physical planet. And ecological imagination, our own imagination, is how we connect with the planet. And of course, we live in a civilization that doesn't recognize that at all. And so we have to break out somehow of this thinking mind and get into our physical bodies, because we can't even see the earth. We can't even see it unless we use our whole bodies. And, as other people have been saying, with our hearts, with our hands, our physical hands, unless we actually can touch the physical stones that actually surround us and make up the planet, that form the land underneath our feet, wherever we live, which of course geologically is different for everybody. Where I am, it happens to be sand, which is actually quite difficult to connect with. This stone is in fact from Ecuador, and I keep it as a memory, really, of that extraordinary land I can no longer go to because I don't fly. But memory is a big part of a practice, and the underworld comes in because we really are a people that, unlike most indigenous and archaic peoples, we don't do the transformation process. We only live in what we want to get out of resources of the earth. We're not actually connecting with the earth. We're not actually becoming the kinds of people that can take responsibility for our walk upon the planet and our relations with all the other beings, as Anab has just been talking about. We are not taught to connect with trees. We're not taught to connect with the rocks or the sea or the plants. So we have to rediscover that ourselves. And part of that is learning to go through an underworld process that throws out all our conditioning, all our education, all the modernity tricks and treats that we've learned, to make space for something to be a completely different kind of human being. And it's not that different, to be honest, because as Anab was saying, the myths and our stories, our deep folk stories, our tales of whatever land we're from, tell us that our ancestral knowledge of how to be on this planet and communicate and use our imaginations to communicate either physically on the earth, in the open, or deep within ourselves, in our solar beings inside, is all in our bones. It's actually here. It's not in the future. It's already here. So I like the stone because for me, the stone and our bones resonate at the same level. They've got that deep time. It takes us into deep time so we can connect. But we do need to go through a process. Sorry, I'm gabbing.
No, that's great. We'll come back. And our last contributor to this conversation today is Nick Hayes. Nick, you recently led, I was very drawn to your pretty powerful uprising in relation to landowners, and you created or you rediscovered this amazing mythic figure, Esme Bogart, as you were developing that process. I wonder, it seemed to me that you were really drawing on the concept of earth goddesses as allies in this fight to reclaim land. I wonder if you could talk through a little bit for you what the ecological imagination means.
Yeah, I've been getting really into it, really. I think a year ago, I might have answered differently. I feel like ecological imagination would have been quite extractive for me. I would have looked at it simply from the perspective of going into nature and what images or what thoughts I can take from it, kind of thing. And it's been two things. It's been this sort of land rights campaign, to get more access to the rivers and woods and open spaces of England. But it's also, there's another I'm researching at the moment.
Is everybody else having trouble with Nick's feed, or is it just me? Okay. Nick,
we can't hear you, Nick.
Maybe we'll come back to you in a second, okay? See if you can fiddle with your internet settings, and we'll see if we can return, if that's all right.
That I'm moored to at the moment is colonial extraction from Canada.
Mona, can you step in and try and see if you can have a chat with Nick and get his internet sorted? Yeah, thank you from Dan Burgess. A suggestion that Nick goes voice only, perhaps. Okay, everybody's on it. All right, we'll leave that for a time being. We'll come back to Nick in a second. So I'd like to just turn to this question of, sorry, Nick, are you back? Let's have another go. Let's see if you can say something.
I feel like I never left you.
Yay, there you go.
I was wittering on about how I used to, or before the last year, I was kind of had this kind of extractive approach to ecological imagination, what I could take in terms of images. But I'm researching at the moment how this particular part of land that I'm moored to at the moment actually made its wealth and enclosed the land as a direct result of building train lines across First Nation nations in what is today called Canada. And that took me right from, the kind of how much wealth was made, how much the kind of stats and the figures, deep into the kind of visions of Crazy Horse and, the kind of shamanic animism that was basically crushed beneath the boot of the, Anglo-Europeans that came to principally divorce the people from the land. And, whilst focusing on, the kind of horrors of colonialism, which are many, the sort of deeper horror of all was like finding out about this culture and the kind of just basically audio booking Black Elk and Crazy Horse, like deep into the nights, just having these words come to me, audio has really pushed me into a more animist. It's what you were saying before, Anab, that sense of reciprocity, that there is actually, you can use your imagination to become part of a circle that isn't kind of give and then take, or take and then give back kind of thing, but is actually one complete act. And the idea of there's one tree that I've been drawing relentlessly since I've been here, and really the act of observation, sort of when you know, when given time, does become an act of homage, an act of reverence, without any kind of pseudo spirituality that I might feel obliged to put on it or anything, but I'm just simply watching the tree change through the seasons and learning about it, and then learning about the fact that it is this kind of cathedral of ecology that supports so much other life. Not from the books, but just by seeing them, because I'm spending so much time there. So I feel like the ecological imagination, for a pithy sentence, is kind of connecting to the other than human, the more than human, or whatever, on a horizontal plane that isn't necessarily about projecting my aims and ambitions onto, say, this tree, but actually trying to be as porous and as open, either through your eyes or your ears or your touch, as you possibly can, to actually appreciate this thing as a kind of living column of water encased within wood, that is doing stuff, that is living actively right now as I am. And I just don't think I'd have made that leap, that kind of animist leap, if it wasn't for basically Crazy Horse and those kind of vivid, very weather-based, you know, I think it just comes from living outside, really, which is something I'm doing more on the boat. Weather becomes, it just enters your dreams, and it's really present all the time. And a wind gushing around the boat 60 miles an hour a couple of days ago, it's not a metaphor of a spirit. I mean, it really is that. And it brings a different feeling in your blood as well. So I feel like those visions and those very vivid responses to the outside have kind of started to turn me into a more animist kind of mindset.
This is fascinating. So I'm going to go in a slightly different direction from where I thought we were going to go. And I want to just sink into this question of relationality and the sorts of practices that you participate in to allow you to connect, or to allow other beings, other ways of knowing in the world to sink into you. And I hear the word you use there, Nick, around porosity. And I'm interested in whether all of you, where the question of vulnerability sits with you in the practice of opening to different ways of knowing, to allow yourself to feel interdependent with others. Is there any resonance there for any of you around these questions of vulnerability or openness? Charlotte?
Yeah, if I'm not stepping in before anyone else, I teach quite a lot of practice for people sitting, you know, going out and encountering the planet wherever they are, either listening to the wind, or to hang out with trees, or to connect with the waterlands where they are. And there's always a crucial point that happens when you do that, which is to do with being open. I don't know, it'd be vulnerable, but that's not necessarily a word I'd use, but you have to be sensitive to allow that porosity that, for example, that Sophie Strand was talking about, to really allow yourself to open to what a tree might be speaking to you with. And for that whole business of slowing down and opening out and going deep, we're so conditioned to be in this tiny space that actually the mind just wants to hold on all the time and says, terror, terror, alert, alert, alert. So if there is vulnerability, it's basically letting that mind thing run out.
Nice.
You know, you have to stop this talking in the head, as one famous Native American said. There's white people just walking around our land, talking in their heads. You know? So we have to stop. Yeah.
Anna, how does that relate to you? Do you hear any resonances with your own work?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know. I think that to kind of create that sense of vulnerability and those practices, I have a feeling we have to do a bit of, I don't know what I'm trying to call de-infrastructuring, actually. I think the problem is that we've infrastructured our way out of any sort of relationship with nature. We've made too many rules and boundaries and structures to then say, okay, now let's have a relationship with nature. I always think about things that happen back at home in Ahmedabad, where I'm from, where, you know, if there's a cow herd nearby in the city, but you know, cows are holy, and you know, any spare food, the cows walking by on the road amongst all the cars and rickshaws, you're just giving the food. I think we need to loosen up and bring some of these relationships into our everyday lives in a more easy forms, like in easier ways. Like this kind of, this is the area for dogs, and this is the area where you are allowed to walk, and you only stand behind the yellow line in this way, and you only do this, and this is all health and safety. And I think we need to start, the porosity needs to start seeping in at all of these levels as well.
That's brilliant. So what I'm hearing from that is that it's not just a kind of personal porosity, it's actually social porosity, openness, relaxing our sense of where certain things belong. And which really ties in with your work, Nick, as well, doesn't it? I mean, this is all about what you're doing. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how we might go about creating a sort of porosity and an openness that's our social, that's at a landscape level.
Yeah, it's you know, borders in nature are actually spaces of transaction. You know, whether they be rivers or ravines or cell walls, they're places where the passing through occurs. Whereas the borders that we've contrived in nature are kind of manufactured socially to stop you. It's a weird thing, like a barbed wire fence is a very easy thing to slip through, and yet there's not even anyone around. And yet there's this sort of mental force field that you confront by crossing this sort of imaginary line. Another example of an imaginary line is the line between England and Scotland, where it's not even a line. You know, there's no barbed wire fence up demarcating Scotland where you're allowed to camp or swim by right of birth, kind of thing. But yet, when you take a step over, it's literally as absurd as that. You take a step over from Scotland, where you have the right to wander, you have the right to roam, you have the right to camp out in nature. You take a literal step over an invisible line, and legislation completely recontextualizes the act that you're doing. And we've been born into this world where we kind of swallow this idea that these man-made laws that historically were made by people that were only allowed to be MPs by virtue of the extent of their land holdings. You know, I mean, it's not controversial. The BBC wouldn't be able to say it, but it's not controversial to say that there is bias in the making of our laws, especially to do with land. But yeah, we are literally saying, like, you know, to be honest, even keep your fences, but make them porous. Obviously, livestock need to be maintained or sort of contained, but we're not livestock. And we can be trusted as long as we, I mean, this is one of the things about Esme Boggart and raising old Crocken on Dartmoor is, and I've been doing a lot of...
Nick, maybe explain that a little bit, because not everybody's familiar, and we've got also a very international audience. So maybe just say a little bit about the background for those things, if you can.
I will probably best to talk about Old Crocken, because we just made up Esme Boggart from friends of ours are getting evicted from this god-awful estate just 5 minutes down the road from us. So we created a silt witch of the Thames Valley to scare the bejesus out of the aristocrats, and it just basically worked. And they're no longer getting evicted, because what is a witch but the sort of central sort of node of a horizontal power shared community that, you know, she is in this case, I mean, there were very real working class women that were the sort of keepers of the plant law, the sort of mythopoetic law. But we just made up this woman, and it allowed us to have a pseudonym, which allowed us not to get evicted by the very same absentee landowners, and that worked. But this sort of idea of Old Crocken in Dartmoor in the south of England, it was the only kind of fragment of space in England that we were legally allowed to wild camp. And then, you know, the most fabulistic pantomime villain creation of a real person called Alexander Darwell, a hedge fund manager with other countless estates, has basically won a court case to overturn our right to wild camp in this beautiful moorland, basically. But what it's really done is ignite or refresh a kind of wrath in that kind of old seditionist English kind of persona that has just done our campaign more than any book that we could have written, more good than that. But what we're saying by raising these Crocken is this old story that kind of inhabits the kind of the spirit of the place of Dartmoor. And we're basically saying there are relationships with nature. There are reciprocal, sustainable codes of conduct with nature that don't just predate private property. They predate nations. They predate the concept of supremacy. They predate capitalism and neoliberalism. And those are our collective folk contracts with nature that have been forged through active participation and experience with local nature or local resources. And those are the codes that we choose to follow because they're natural codes. Because, you know, if I cut down all the trees then and have a really warm winter on the boat, then my grandchildren are going to freeze. It's just as simple as that, you know.
I wonder, Anab and Charlotte, if there's anything that you've heard so far that you want to respond to in terms of what we've been saying about this, about the internal and external borders and boundaries, about the porosity, about the need for ecological imagination as a set of relations. Are there any responses to what's been said so far that you'd like to pick up? Charlotte.
I was really interested, Nick, in your saying the expression of this kind of mental force field that happens when one confronts barbed wire or hedges or anything that says, do not enter, this is mine, not yours. And how there's a, you know, I've taken people foraging, for example, and they kind of like, you know, there's a whole thing that happens to the body that says, I'm not allowed to do that. It's not mine. I do not have permission to, you know, even take a blackberry, which is wild. It's like, it doesn't belong to anybody. But how to kind of break, so my question is that those force fields do feel real. They feel real. Our culture is completely underpinned by violence and state violence in many ways. And these landowners that Nick is talking about have exerted their power on this land for hundreds of years. So whatever land we go into, that is still resonant there. But my question is really, how do we break open those force fields or get something stronger within our being so we're not intimidated? As you must have, I mean, what makes you able to just like go and trespass in this really wonderful and exuberant, exciting, intelligent way? And what would you say, Nick, that we need to break those force fields?
Well, it is, let's be honest, much easier for me because society has empowered me because of the color of my skin and the genitals that I possess, basically. It's like, you know, there is an element to this that it's all right for white male cis dude to go tromping over the countryside and say how everyone else should have the right to do it as well. But I mean, the truth is, when we're organizing trespasses for all different sort of what you might call categories of people kind of thing, the tricky part of that is that the arm of the law is biased and the penalties are often greater for people from marginalized communities to do the same thing. So fundamentally, we're looking, our campaign, whilst, you know, bog standard, we're looking to change the law. What we're really trying to do is to change the culture of how we relate to nature. And the landowners will say, you can't be trusted on the land. And we'll say, well, you can't be trusted to own the land because it's not, you know, it's not the wild swimmer that pours industrial agricultural runoff into our rivers and, you know, hyperoxygenates the, you know, we're not the ones cutting down the forests, we're the ones observing it. But we're looking to, it's basically anarchism, isn't it? We're looking to show people that that there are laws and codes of reciprocity and sustainability that run deeper than these laws that sort of these paternalistic utterances from on high that tell us what we can and can't do. There are actual, sorry.
No, I want to bring Anab in, because one of the things that I know your work does is it takes people into other places. It allows people to connect with where they're not. And one of the things that can happen with this conversation about ecology and imagination and land is that it can be something that becomes, if we're not careful, something that preserves those who've already got relationships with land in some way, those who find it familiar. And actually this question of the imagination is absolutely critical here. How do we imagine and rethink our relationships with land in different ways from different places? And Sophie was talking about that earlier. As a disabled woman, her relationship with land is very different. So I'd just like to bring Anab in here around, you know, what are the sorts of practices that you work with that might enable people to imagine and to connect with land in different ways, perhaps without actually being there, which I know is a contentious topic in this area, but maybe just...
Yeah. No, I was thinking about it. I was actually thinking about the power, because, you know, in the work we're trying to do, and in the work we want to do more of, is this question that when they came up, that this person can just come and gather people and say, right, we're not going to allow any wild camping, and this happens over and over again in so many different ways. And so it's like we're talking amongst ourselves a little bit. We're not really talking to power that lies outside of, you know, like I'm really interested in exploring what are the ways in which we can all yield our own spheres of power and influence and bring them collectively, and what are the tools and practices that can help us find our own power to be able to work individually and collectively to become a strong force in the face of this kind of very top-down power that exists. And you know, like, you know, the recognition of the sort of non-linearity, I want to say almost quantum nature of all the sort of systems in place, the kind of systemic wisdom, as Gregory Bateson says, the systemic wisdom that exists in the work that we're all trying to do. How does that become so strong and so powerful that we are able to move past some of these barriers? Because the work of imagination, of taking people to that other world, to the other places, to those alternate futures, then also requires us to start creating the tools and putting those tools in place, very loosely, conceptual tools in place to enable that transition. I'm really interested in long-term impact of enabling that transition to those other futures, and you know, those futures that are in superposition with our current one, adjacent to. So yeah, I'm really interested in the meta picture right now, because I'm really curious to understand what are the different ways in which we can poke holes at the current state of affairs, if that helps.
That raises some really interesting questions to me about how we see ourselves in space. I mean, I remember, you know, whenever I'm teaching around these topics, so much of the time is you hear people talking about, well, it's just me on my own. What can I achieve? What can I do? And actually the ecological imagination for me is two things. One, it reconnects us. It relocates us in relations of reciprocity with other people and interdependence. And two, it allows us to see a bigger system as interconnected in ways that we have no we actually don't have control. So I work with the images, for example, of two stones dropping in water and seeing the ripples that come out, and the ripples as they interact become beyond the control of each individual stone. It's an image from Cann. And if we're thinking about quantum change, quantum shifts, there are consequences that ripple out from each of our actions which we can't understand. So the ecological imagination that we're working with here is shifting away from, or rather maybe it's grounded in, but it's shifting away from the idea of the ecological imagination as associated with land, perhaps, towards the ecological imagination as ecology. How do we think of ourselves as part of ecology? And we've got the whole field of eco-psychology, for example, reframing us as humans, our mind, as not just inside our skulls, but as distributed, interconnected with each other. So I don't know if any of you want to respond to any of that. I have another question. Let me know.
I do want to say something about this idea of indigenous collective relationships, because, you know, how do groups, especially those that are often oppressed or marginalized, communicate their collectively held values and future visions to other people? Like, you know, I know, how do you as a group go and talk to policymakers? There are so many gaps right now, practically thinking about making tangible these ripple effects and acknowledging the value of these ripple effects on our shared futures, on our collective shared futures. I think there are some real deep challenges that if I stand in front of a politician and if I tell them, let's talk about ecological imagination, they're like, I'm not sure it'll land really. Like, you know, what are those shared vocabularies we need to create? What are those shared methodologies we need to create? And I think that's where my head is at. But yeah,
well, let's get to that. What are the vocabularies that you use, each of you, or the practices that you use to sort of make concrete this very vague words that we're using here, ecological imagination? Let's think really concretely. What are the practices or the words that you use that would allow us to crack open these senses of independence, relationality? Next thing. Okay, so let's anchor down into practice. Okay, Charlotte. Yeah.
I think what the most effective way that I've been discovering really in the last few years is that we absolutely can't do this thing on our own. And we work collectively at Dark Mountain, both editing, both in terms of the books, which are always a collective of writings and artwork. And so the teaching is the same. It's like invite people to go out and encounter their local territories. But then the practice is then to come back with what you have experienced. Not simply then relate it to your fellows in a certain way. And also to translate what you've experienced into a creative form. So I think this whole thing of speaking it out loud, so it's physical, because that is our voices are physical. And if we just kind of do this as an internal solo individualistic practice, it stays in here and it's still in the mind. But once you start speaking out loud, once you start sharing, and knowing that no matter where you are, you're all doing the same thing at once. You're all going out to encounter the wind, or you're all going out to encounter the water. Then you come back and share. Something else is being built. You know that.
Just to interrupt, it sounds to me as though you're giving people some reasonably specific instructions. You're not saying just go out there. You're saying go out there and encounter the wind or something else. So, you know, can you just drill down into what sort of frames you give people as they go out and connect?
Well, the frame is that you're going to have to share something at the end of the day. Okay. So there will be a show. There's a show and tell. So that's the frame. So you go out and you bring something back and then you show and tell it, and you have a certain amount of time to do that in. So it's quite hermetic in that way. It is quite a strong frame. But I think all the practices I've ever done really over the last 20 years have all had that shape. going out and coming back. So there's that loop, that's that feedback loop all the time. You know, we're such end users, linear people, but really to encounter the non-linearity of the planet, you really have to get into the dance and do the stuff, right? You have to be in the water, you have to be rocked about by the wind, you know, you have to meet the creature and all that. So that's really valuable, and we don't have the words for it, so we have to create them.
Actually, you bring back to me Martin Shaw's work, which is that sort of invitation to kind of encounter the forest, but then return to the village and tell the stories about it.
Absolutely.
But Nick, I mean, I was really interested in your practice of drawing. I mean, you're an illustrator, and you talked about that connection with the tree through drawing. Is that the practice that you have to connect and relate differently with land, with other beings? What sorts of practices are you engaged in?
Recently it's it's been carving, to be honest. There's something about you know, all of my illustrations, you can mess around with them on Photoshop and change them, and they exist solely as TIFFs or JPEGs, and that's fine. That's sort of, you know, that puts boots on my feet and food on my table and stuff. But there's something about craft, which is using the materials, smelling the materials, you know, just being on a boat. I haven't paid for wood for the last 3 years, you know, for the stove kind of thing. You just go out there and find the dead standing, saw it up, and you start to learn how lime smells compared to ash, not when you burn it, but when you saw it, you know, it starts to give off heat. Then carving, you know which woods are buttery and which, like, I save blocks of yew wood, like bottles of champagne, for when mates come round, because it's like cutting through marble. You know, if you get a chunk of yew that big, it's like 15 minutes worth of sawing. There's something into it. But also it changes the way that you're walking through the woods. You know, if I'm looking for sticks to carve into, you know, kingfisher handles or something like that, you find your neck craning to find the straight staff. You're kind of, your eyes are running up the trees like squirrels, kind of thing. You're not walking there. You're not looking at eye level. You're kind of climbing into the coppice to see if that's the stick that you're looking for. And so everything becomes more visceral. And there's something cool about craft. One, in it's just that object. You don't make anything else. You can't replicate it. You can't photocopy it or reprint it, kind of thing. But also, it doesn't allow for. It's just a lot more visceral. You can really you spend time with that one particular block of wood or whatever, and there is almost like a tapestry or a quilt. There is time woven into it, and that becomes a kind of meditative. That's why these objects become quite totemic, I think, and they sort of, there's the audio book that you were listening to whilst you carved it. There's the conversation you had with your lover whilst you were carving it. That's all in there somehow, kind of thing. Can I just say, I was hoping to say something about, because Charlotte was basically talking about manifesting thoughts into words, which, you know, linguists call speech acts, and you know, shamans call magic or spells. And that's something that's really powerful to utterance, to change the sort of externality. But also what Anab was saying about like marginalized communities, like how do you gather together and then bring your demands or pleas or perspective even to points of power, and it's that's just the stage that we're at with Right to Roam. You know, Labour have just announced the Right to Roam Act, and the Green Party is supporting us, and Lib Dems and all of that kind of thing. And there is something really, really dispiriting about collectivizing, finding your own language, finding what really, you know, sort of motivates you, and, you know, shared love and solidarity, and then bringing that to this very, very small funnel, this very, very blinkered mindset, and trying to like thumb it through, like squidge it all through, and it just comes out the same shape as every fucking other policy that they dream up. And so I think what we're, in terms of words, you know, we started off trying to shape our campaign to their very, you know, a small focus kind of thing. And we, you know, like tourist revenue, people, more people in the countryside, mental health, physical health. And as the years have gone by, it's like we're now in our third year. The word that we would have avoided for being dismissed as being woolly-headed, utopian, hippie, pot-smoking, Bob Dylan listening 60s, you know, whimsies, is the word that we use all the time now, which is love. And we, you know, we have the creativity, we have the love, and they have all the money and the land. And I'm really starting to realize that, you know, as 60s lyric cliche as it sounds, like love is the energy that that will somehow override these kind of small blinkered systems that they use to affect change. And it is deeply frustrating that you can create so much and then still you have to take it to the door, to this, you know, austere, shiny black door of Downing Street. It's got nothing to do with the reality on the land.
Anna, did you want to respond to that?
I mean, these are all great sorts of vocabularies in the looser sense of the word. You know, if I had to put my kind of artist, designer, futurist hat on, I would say, yes, you know, we've been doing this for a while, and we're, you know, the idea of embodied intelligence and bringing the people who are in the decision-making capacities into these future worlds with us, with our collective ideas and imaginations, and getting them to actually live and breathe and think from that space of the other, rather than from, you know, sitting and watching their PowerPoints or their kind of policy papers. Like, actually, this is possible. It's not only possible, you are standing inside of it. And then if I suppose if I had my critical activist hat on, I would, and if anybody has any influence, I would love to wander the corridors of Whitehall and spread some gossip and rumors about other ways, and use the tools and vocabularies that they use to lobby for other worlds in a way.
Charlotte.
I think it's true. I think the thing about the two dynamics at play, which Nick was talking about, the sort of the love, and there's this love and creativity, right? And then there's power, and I think for me it's like the practices, the engagement in the imagination, the engagement in creativity strengthens. You know, it's what Tyson Yunkaporta talks about: increased ceremony. The more you gather in a certain way, the more you speak out loud around a fire in the same way, the more you go, yeah, absolutely. You are thickening, if you like, the web of correspondences between people and place, and all living beings. And whilst we have to, in a sense, negotiate with the power systems that may stop the rivers or stop the mountains being desecrated, nevertheless, that part, that creative gathering, the acknowledgement of mythic beings, the acknowledgement of oak trees, the love of rivers, the love of being together in that way, has to come first. Because if it doesn't come first, and we spend all our time trying to convince the powers to change, we're going to neglect that really essential work that we're talking about now, that connection with the imagination, which has been totally colonized. I wanted you said you wanted something practical. I was going to okay, this is practical, right? This is how we spend our lives, in this box. You know, it's like, how do we break out of it and connect? Because that is the thing that will hold us together when times are falling apart, in times of collapse. It is those creative connections that will keep us together.
I want to drill down, and thank you for that. Drill down into this question. We were talking about the more we gather, the more we sit around the fire and sit outside. Okay, so for those people who are living in cities at the moment, who may find it incredibly difficult to get out of that, that sounds like a particular set of images for those people who can do this. And this question of what resources we need to have available in order to be able to participate in these ways. One of my questions is, can we create these experiences of connection that you've just said, of love for different other beings in spaces that aren't, if you like, already rural? To me, the question of what the urban practice of this looks like is one that I'd like to just try to see what thoughts the three of you have on this. Or is the response simply, we need to create rights for everybody to be able to participate in many, many different practices in terms of relation to wilderness nature more than human others? Where are the three of you around that at the moment?
Can I just quickly respond to that in particular with the thing I was talking about, to do with cities? Because in fact, many of the teachings I do have been online. Yeah. And then people go out wherever they are. And there have been cities all over, it doesn't make any difference where you are. There's always the land. There's always the weather. There are always trees somewhere. But it's not. And even if you gather online, originally we only went online because of lockdown. But originally I was very skeptical that you could actually create a feeling of connection through technology. But it's absolutely possible because people are going out into the physical world and coming back with their story. So it actually creates, even though it's a virtual fire, what you're doing is in that spirit, it's as though there's a fire between us because you've all lit a fire together in your various territories, even in a tin can, on a roof, in a city.
I love that phrase, there's always weather. I'm actually really interested in the word weather that's come out of this conversation, and that sense of allowing ourselves to be weathered and to encounter weather. Anyway, sorry. So yeah, Nick, Anab, either of you want to respond to this question of the city, the urban, the rural?
I can. I mean, I grew up in a very, very, very urban thing. I used to think of small hills when I came to England as mountains. It's a flat desert-ish landscape, and really have recognized over the years that to access nature is such a privilege. To be able to go into nature and have spent time in nature, and actually like in nature in the way that people go for walks into forests, and it is not accessible to most people who live in really inner cities around the world. And actually and over the years my kind of practice has been to just really observe on the idea of noticing the smallest beings. So I spend a lot of time photographing the tiniest lichen on a branch fallen on the edge of the sidewalk or the footpath in the city, or a little moss growing on the wall, because actually it is really about noticing what it is, where it is, and acknowledging that these are nitrogen fixes, these are the beings that are holding things together, like in the small, in the little, in the tiny, in what's around you, because a lot of people in the world don't actually have access to nature in the way we understand it.
Thank you. Nick?
Yeah, exactly the same. I was going to mention an artist we're working with at the moment called Bryony Ben Jabbat, who, basically, we were chatting about porosity and her practice for a book we're going to collaborate on. But her thing as well is, noticing the lichen, noticing the moss. And it makes me think of the rebel botanists in lockdown who would go and just chalk the names of the weeds that were growing through the cracks, kind of thing. And instantly that pragmatic, bog standard, this is the name, notice it. Noticing is the first step towards reverence and, seeing the sacredness in the life that is everywhere. But also that makes me think of, beneath the pavement, the sand kind of thing, those sort of that kind of anarchist notion that the urban is simply a constructed shell over whether it's a psychological or just real physical infrastructure. It is a shell that has been constructed over and excluding nature, but nature is everywhere. And yeah, this idea, I used to live in London in a tower block on the 11th floor. And it was very hard in lockdown, for example, the first one, to get any access to nature, because we'd usually go to Epping Forest, but we weren't allowed. But the weather, again, you're right up in the sky, and you can see from the 11th floor, you can see the rain clouds coming in. And there's just something very exciting about watching the rain approach you, and then it starts to rain. There is something about observing that kind of, it doesn't just rain on you, it's an actual part of a physical process that is moving across the land. Yeah, I think the weather happens to everyone, doesn't it? So
I love this principle of the democratic experience of weather. That to me feels like something we can take away and play with. Welcome back, Charlotte. Anab, did you want to respond to that? I think you were going to say something a minute ago.
No, I so agree with Nick, but I do think the weather doesn't happen to everyone in the same way.
Yes.
Yeah, and literally it's going to be more and more so that the weather is going to happen so differently to so many of us. It's happening in so many parts of the world. So just wanted to recognize that. Yeah.
Thank you. That's great. Hugely important statement, which gets to this question of the politics of the ecological imagination. So we've sort of talked a little bit about some of the poetics, about the making, about the reverence and the noticing, but also the critical importance of the politics of this, the social divides that separate us from land and relation with others, the political divides that disconnect us from politicians, where we want to try and affect particular changes. So all of these things need thinking about together. We have very short amount of time left. I'd like to just invite you to make any last comments on anything that you wanted to say today, but maybe didn't get a chance to say, or to share something that you can share. So I'll just go around, whoever wants to go first, just for a little last reflection. Anything that you didn't get the chance to go deep into that you wanted. Charlotte?
I don't mind saying something. There was loads I wanted to say. It's such a great conversation. Thanks for having us all together. I just wanted to say, in relation to what you were saying about the politics of things, in my experience, I was born in a city. I learned everything about plants in a city. I was born into a position of privilege in many ways. But the thing that I really learned is that the earth doesn't care where you come from, what color you are, what class you are, how much money you've got, what you look like. It is all about, as Nick said, it's about love and connection and communication. And that, I think, is the primary thing we need to start with, without going, oh, there's everything dividing us. There's everything connecting us. It's called being in a human body and having a human imagination that connects to everything and everybody. And I think that is the tabula rasa. That's where we need to start.
Interesting. Okay, I could start a whole other conversation on that particular moment. Nick, and do you want any last reflections?
What Charlotte said, I think, honestly. Yeah, it's been a pleasure to be here, and thanks everyone for listening. Thanks for the invite as well.
Thanks. Anna?
Yeah, no, thank you. Sounds like the rest of the day is going to be amazing as well. So really honored to be part of this. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, all three of you, for your thoughts and your comments, and all power to the work that you are, all three of you, currently involved with. I hope that everybody can read more about the work that you're doing, learn more from you, and build those alliances that we've been talking about, build that community, that connection, because we won't be doing this on our own. So that for me, what's come out of this is that real sense of the ecological imagination as the ecology that we're part of, that sense of relations between us and the power that there is in that. So thanks all again for your contributions. I'll hand back to Farah now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie, and what a brilliant panel. We heard about how we create porosity within ourselves and within our social structures how we break open force fields and break through fear, what tools are needed to enable other futures, and how do we think of ourselves as ecology. The conversation turned towards a more practical bent as well in terms of what are those shared vocabularies, but actually our speakers reminded us that those shared vocabularies must start with experiences and individual practice, which are then spoken out loud, that we should be turning to craft and physicality and love and creativity, and that finding ways for people to stand inside imaginations, and then have an experiential journey to it. We need direct engagement and gathering together. On that note, it is time for lunch. I'm sure you're all very pleased to hear, so you have some time to digest the wonderful and far-reaching corners that we've been taken on this morning already. I hope you'll spend some time noticing everything that connects us, and looking after your bodies as well. We'll be back at 1 p.m. For the next panel. So enjoy your break and enjoy your lunch if you're at a time where you're eating lunch or breakfast or dinner, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you all.